Starting back in July of 1875, the monks of St. Arlo the Evangelist had come into the public eye, those scholars who had continued to quietly catalog history for hundreds of years. In fact, they had specifically come under fire from the University of Chashtol, Vannonia's largest university, criticizing the country itself for placing the main mechanism of historicity in the hands of a religious order. Those secular scholars argued that they were unable to be objective and unable to produce the same quality of research or quantity of work as those in academia. So, in response, the scholars of St. Arlo produced a geographical and geopolitical treatise of the age the likes of which nothing at the time could compare. The work they published was called the Encyclopedia Totalis, which was released to the public in July of 1878. It was so impressive and all-encompassing that the government itself passed legislation in order to commend the monks of St. Arlo the Evangelist and grant them a great deal of funds to do with as they pleased. The monks of St. Arlo decided to use these massive funds as an endowment for a new university in Glasgow called St. Vincenzo University, after the brother monk who traveled with Arlo to Vannin. SVU would come to be a major rival to Chashtol University, and their rivalry would later flare up annually in various intercollegiate sports competitions. However, it is the contents of the Encyclopedia Totalis that are more important than the book's effects. It begins by listing the great powers of the world as they existed in 1878, listed in illumined detail immediately after the index. These great powers of the age, as they were called, were as follows in descending order: India, Italy, Visegrad, Poland-Lithuania, Vannonia, France, Lakandu, and China. This encyclopedia was scandalous to some, but it simply revealed some unspoken truth, realized over a century ago now. That Europe and European powers had once such an advantage in technology, innovation, and even population, which was wasted, totally squandered by the days of blood. The reality of history was that that war allowed the rest of the world to catch up with the West, resulting in a much more even playing field the world over. Though, using India as an example, the Encyclopedia Totalis only measured overall power, not the efficient use of said power. While India had the largest army and most powerful industry, due to irregularities in the government and corruption in the economic sphere, India was quite unable to utilize this power in a productive or offensive way. Regardless of this general realization, the pages that followed cataloged the continents and the major nations upon them, including general conditions and notable facts about them in particular. First, Europe, the continent which was home to the greatest number of great powers, and indeed the continent from which Vannonia hailed. Beginning with the home country, Vannonia was in a precarious position in the late 19th century. Only measuring up at 5th amongst the great powers, it was a nation of seemingly wasted potential. The dearth was being handled rather poorly, and filtered through a deeply divisive and corrupt political system. A catastrophic 20% of the population was unemployed, while the politicians had their say in the world's largest international trade company, the Grand Atlantic Charter. Some were motivated by genuine aspirations to make the world a better place, or even by ideology, but those who ruled the day were the expert career politicians who knew how to filter out value towards them and away from others. Things had only gotten worse with the French slavery debacle, which was bad enough to spark a wave of abolition movements across Europe. A great deal of ethnically French people still lived in the areas conquered by Vannonia in recent years, and with the enslavement of their brothers they began to radicalize, seeing themselves as enemies of the capitalist Vannonian ruling classes. This resulted in them linking up with the underground French Communist Party just across the border, especially in the Aquitanian Corridor, as it was called. It was in that corridor that the Francophone Front, or FF, was founded, and championed a brand of communism which conflated the Vannonian identity with capitalism itself, dubbed Francophonism, fusing French nationalism and revolutionary Marxism. This was, naturally, very alluring to the French minority in the region, and they would come to engage in political violence for years to come. As for its international affairs, Vannonia was secure at home, militarily stronger than its immediate neighbors, and with the naval power to back it up. The Gallic region was also dominated by Vannonia, though the Kingdom of France and the Italian Empire were also major contenders in the region. Even Poland-Lithuania managed to snake its way in through the north. Though, the major characteristic of the area was budding ethnic strife and the growth of communism amongst the underclass. France was reeling from the dearth, and was a country embarrassed over and over again, at odds with their proud culture. This attitude made the otherwise beautiful countryside an ugly place to live, and spurred the growth of the communist element in that country. The Italian region was dominated by the Empire of Italy, which was ascendant at that time. The most recovered from the dearth and pursuing a thriving colonial empire in Africa, it was the most powerful European country in the world. At the moment, it was directing that energy southwards against Mali, though the interloper of Benevento was spared its rage as a puppet of Poland-Lithuania, which made them Italy's most major enemy on the world stage. The Germanic region was Germanic in name only, with puny Brandenburg and the North German Federation both puppets of larger powers, Poland-Lithuania and France respectively. There were hardly any Germans even left at this point in history, converted to the cultures of those who owned the land and forced new traditions upon them, like Italy, Poland-Lithuania, Alencon, Scandinavia, and even Vannonia. The total population of ethnic Germans who spoke any dialect of German as a first language in 1878 was estimated to only be around 300,000. So peculiar, the European culture that was once so dominant could face such a thorough doom. Northern Europe was essentially the playground of Scandinavia, though the dearth had devastated them so completely that they weren't even a great power, despite being one of the largest countries in Europe and indeed the world. As such, the Republic of Scandinavia faced many issues. Of course, the powder keg that was Livomo constantly whipped up international support for its claim on the Baltics, and even attempted to wage war upon the Republic to its north again and again, with the help of fellow absolutists in Poland-Lithuania. Beyond that, however, Scandinavia had a unique ethnic makeup which also contributed to the nation's divisions. By 1878, the country was made up of 60% ethnic Scandinavians like Swedes and Norwegians, but 40%, or 11 million people, were Ashkenazi Jews. This was 3/4 of the Jewish population in Europe at the time. As a result, they were deeply ingrained in the culture and society of the Republic, and constituted a huge number of landowners, businessmen, and even sailors. They were characterized by being at odds with the very concept of Scandinavia being a republic at all, as they preferred to re-establish the monarchy which so adamantly advocated for and protected them. Meanwhile, the ethnic Scandinavians made up the vast majority of farmers, government officials, and those in the army. As the dearth had stolen prosperity from both groups, they pointed fingers at each other to make up the difference, which of course resulted in widespread violence. Pogroms were common, wiping sometimes whole Jewish towns off the map. And it was also common for Jews to victimize those Scandinavians which lived on their land, leading to scandals where they often scourged them to death in disputes over suspected slights or had them arrested on false charges. It truly wasn't a single country at that point, but two, one of Scandinavian Republicans and one of Jewish monarchists. And the two hated each other. Eastern Europe was dominated by Poland-Lithuania and Visegrad, who were constantly at odds with each other as well, though Lekandu and Livomo also had scant holdings in the region. All of the absolutist regimes that called Eastern Europe home were despots of the highest order, and employed serfdom on a widespread basis. Poland-Lithuania was a highly industrialized, militarized empire with an underclass of dissatisfied minorities like Greeks, Croats, Serbs, and Bosnians, while Visegrad was a vast agricultural kingdom which dominated most of the Black Sea and ruled over their own unhappy minorities of Tatars, Armenians, Ukrainians, Moldavians, and others. The two would most likely be higher up on the list of great powers if they weren't trying so fervently to slaughter one another every few years. This was the same situation in the Balkans, which were entirely controlled by the same two rivals. Anatolia was dominated by Neapolis, which was stable and secure, even if they were broadly impoverished. Though Poland-Lithuania held the jewel of that region, Constantinople, and Lakandu was attempting to seep into the region by way of sending settler families into it. The eastern Mediterranean was largely the domain of the Empire of Lakandu, a sprawling, ancient realm which lorded lazily over vast amounts of oil and was content to hoard its wealth. However, as a result of the dearth, it has been forced to diversify. Indeed, despite having more land to the east and south, the eastern Mediterranean was its true home. They were a champion of Hellenism, which put them at odds with Poland, Lithuania, and indeed the minorities that they themselves ruled over. New technology was seen with suspicion, and even their cities were built with classical Greek concepts in mind. Iskandaria, which straddled the Egyptian Nile, was Lakandu's vestigial puppet. Why they weren't consumed ages ago is a mystery, and most likely comes down to some eccentric custom or tradition. North Africa was a simple affair. Once controlled by the Burgos Federation so many years ago, Italy called it its own, and actively struggled against Mali for control of it. The Iberian Peninsula shadowed a similar struggle, but far less successful. The Burgos Federation was a debt-ridden, inflexible republic that was a husk of its former self, squandering all the money it received from its South African and South American colonies on pursuing eternal war against the Malians. To the east, the Middle East displayed the sprawling glory of Lakandu, a nation of another age, preferring to conquer territory, leave the people they conquer alone, and live simply, luxuriating upon the back of their oil wealth, mandating Hellenistic styles of dress and education in their larger cities. Though they did have enemies, in the form of Khorasan, Islamic fundamentalists, and the Abdalids, evasive desert raiders that Lakandu had not the time nor energy to pursue. Though they did allow the Hajj to continue for those Muslims that wished to make the journey, so long as they dressed in a Greek fashion, showing a shocking amount of tolerance for the faith of their enemies. Interestingly enough, Wallachia to their north was not a puppet or a rival, but an ally whom they contracted mercenary soldiers from on a regular basis. Wallachia had found its new home in the Caucasus well suited for it, and its most recent generation scarcely missed the old country their fathers called home. Africa was under the influence of Europe like the sands were blasted beneath the desert sun. Mali was crumbling due to the 1-2 punch of losing their main revenue stream with the abolition of slavery, and then subsequently getting all of those slaves back. Riots were common, and roving bands of former slaves wandered West Africa, causing them to lose control of huge swaths of land that were then snatched up by opportunistic European empire builders, like Poland, Lithuania. Mali was only just able to dedicate enough resources to victimizing the Burgosi people, though not enough to resist Italy or Lakandu. Even Yao, from whom they had sourced their slaves for centuries, managed to chip away at their eastern border. Further south, Lakandu plunged deeper into Africa, though totally denied any opportunity of a coastline there by the machinations of the Islamic Trade Republic Ajuran, which had civilized enough and appropriated enough technology to do such a thing to the Greeks to their north. Such an achievement was their pride and joy. The Congo was having a great deal of trouble advancing at all, and at this point was little more than a direct source of slaves to the Burgosi diamond mines of South Africa and the Burgosi plantations of the New World. Even Scandinavia settled the area known to some as Mozambique. Madagascar was unique in all Africa for being left on its own, fighting its isolated battle against itself. To the east, Asia was a burgeoning cauldron of powers, some ascendant, some fallen, and others isolated completely. Starting in South and Central Asia, there is of course the juggernaut of the region, India, which was on a campaign of expansion northward. Their recent change of bureaucratic structure had made them much more efficient. East Asia, meanwhile, was in an odd position. The Qing had become the Grand Republic of China, and were poised to make the most of their potential right when the dearth hit. Scarcely anyone voted in their elections of lifelong presidents, and it had devolved into little more than an oligarchy with glorious language about democracy and republicanism in general. This made them the enemy of the weaker yet more prosperous nations which surrounded them, like the kingdoms of Shu, Yue, Wu, and the isolationist shogunate of Japan. Very strangely, however, rogue Lakandu sailors attempted to invade Hokkaido at some point for fame and glory, failed, settled the Sakhalin island chain, and alerted the mother country, which claimed them as its own. This didn't change much or influence anything else in the region, but it did mean that they had a resupply point for lost ships. Southeast Asia and Oceania were a smattering of rivals to India like Siak and Brunei, while Oceania itself was uninhabited save for a smattering of Vannonian criminals and their landlords who kept dying. Needless to say, the Vannonian colonization of the region was a fairly worthless endeavor that was doomed from the start. North America was an ugly mess of titles and claims, though the Kingdom of Washington and the Scandinavian Republic finally made peace with one another, even if it brought a fit of nausea to any who looked upon it. The Kingdom of Washington was a young country, an agricultural breadbasket with a drive to explore and conquer, while thousands of Scandinavians were forever stranded in the Great Plains. Vannonian colonies in Quebec and Mexico were more stable, and served as points of safe call and resupply against the Private Property Preservation Front, which was based out of South America. The Caribbean and Vannonian Mexico represented loyalist strongholds for their respective governments. South America itself was also characterized by a mess of claims, with a ring of totally rebellious Vannonian territories surrounding the Burgosi colonies, which presided over jungle mostly, save for the south, where there was some meaningful farmland. This was the world as it stood in 1878, though it was about to change drastically due to a very strange and rapid chain of events. In August, the issue of the United Baltic Provinces arose yet again, raised by Scandinavia this time. This was because Livomo refused to relinquish their exclave in Trondheim, even while almost everybody living in Trondheim was Scandinavian. A small minority of Livomo masters ruled the area, and Scandinavia accused them of mistreating the Scandinavian majority, demanding that they either release the United Baltic Provinces and allow those people to have a say in their lives via democratic vote of which Trondheim would be a part, or relinquish the province to Scandinavia. Livomo counterclaimed that Trondheim was theirs by law, and in fact they had historical claims in the provinces surrounding Trondheim as well, demanding their return, or the return of Scandinavia's monarchy. Indeed, the chips fell in the same place as last time, though exacerbated tenfold. Italy and Vannonia supported the United Baltic Provinces, and Poland, Lithuania, and France supported the Livomo monarchy. In an upset, Visegrad threw their hat into the ring and declared their support for the United Baltic Provinces in 1879, a gesture of defiance against their arch-rival Poland, Lithuania. Despite things being stacked against them the way they were, by April, Poland, Lithuania had not backed down, managing to pull in a great deal of minor powers like Neapolis, Benevento, Alençon, and Wallachia. This caused Lokondu, not wanting its many weak neighbors to become stronger or fall under the sway of Poland-Lithuania, to support the United Baltic Provinces in a desperate attempt to throw the balance and prevent war. In response, Poland-Lithuania promised the return of the Western Sahara to Mali if they joined in on the side of Livomo. They agreed, which caused the Burgos Federation to join on the side of the United Baltic Provinces. Sensing an opportunity to clean up the remnants of Scandinavian colonies in the New World and even gain new land from Vannonia, the Kingdom of Washington threw their support behind their fellow monarchy Livomo. Italy attempted to mediate peace, realizing just out of hand this was getting, and called the Wurmberg Conference on the 13th of April 1879, due to that city's central location to the parties involved. At this conference, they brought to the delegates' attention that absolutely nobody involved could really afford yet another war. People across the continent were destitute, starving, living out of tents if they were lucky. Homelessness exploded from a few 100,000 to millions across the continent. Literacy had fallen from around 70% to 60% of men. Predatory monopolies were the drivers of all economic activity and were beholden to nobody as they were often intertwined with the government itself, as was the case with the Grand Atlantic Charter. And of course, the bubbling cauldron of communist malcontents that skulk about the gutters of the civilized world's largest cities. But, of course, nobody listened. Their dignity being on the line and the potential for victory over their foes was more important than risking the lives of millions. On the 6th day of the week-long conference, a fire broke out, and 20 delegates died. The Francophone Front was widely suspected to be behind this attack, but no confirmation was ever obtained. So, by the end of the month, on April 24th, 1879, French troops flooded the Aquitanian Corridor, triggering the complex alliance network that had just been constructed, and Europe was engulfed by continental war. One could travel from the Congo to Visegrad and not find peace. As such, this conflict would officially come to be known as the Continental War. On one side of the conflict, there was the Concord of Liberty, which fought for the United Baltic Provinces, consisting of Vannonia, Italy, Visegrad, Scandinavia, Lokandu, and the Burgos Federation. And on the other side, there was the Civilized League, fighting on behalf of Livomo, consisting of Poland, Lithuania, France, the Kingdom of Washington, Mali, Neapolis, Wallachia, Alençon, and Benevento. Initial gains were made on all sides, brutally and swiftly, on the backs of new mechanized military technology like armor-piercing rounds, improved shotguns, and grenades. In Europe, the entire first year of the war was like this, as nobody knew what to expect or how to prepare for it. A huge amount of military operations occurred that year, some listed here in no particular order. France, lacking the general military might for such a significant operation, struck a deal with the French Communist Party and the Francophone Front in order to swiftly close the Aquitanian Corridor, which were then reinforced by Crown troops. This move largely cut off Vannonia from the Mediterranean Sea. Poland-Lithuania invaded and occupied most of the Vannonian North Sea exclave chain, shutting down Vannonian power projection in the Baltic. Italy invaded Polish-Lithuanian land in the south and burst straight through to Benevento, conquering it entirely in one swift advance. The Burgos Federation, backed now by Vannonian and Italian guns and equipment, finally gained the strategic edge it needed against Mali, their eternal rival. Mali was distinctly overwhelmed almost immediately by the scale of this war, so by year's end the Burgosi advance had ended the 140-year presence of Mali in Europe, save for the Balearics, which were fortified by France and did not surrender. This was considered a glorious resurgence for the Burgos Federation, which went on a killing spree as soon as they reached the coast, emptying the war-torn land of any Malians who had since settled there, which was admittedly not many outside of the big cities like Madrid. However, tens of thousands were still purged, and indeed the Burgosian military did little else that year but pursue a policy of ethnic cleansing. Mainland Mali had no response, being too caught up in preventing Italy from overrunning their entire country. Poland-Lithuania launched a vicious attack on Visegrad, utilizing mobile mortars which could be moved and fired closer to the front line, pushing the agricultural power back to the shores of the Black Sea. Indeed, in the last 4 months of the war, Visegrad met its doom, being partitioned between Poland-Lithuania, Wallachia, and Neapolis, with its remaining husk puppeted directly by the Polish-Lithuanian crown. Wallachia had no qualms about abandoning its old ally Lokandu for its new ally Poland-Lithuania, and expanded duly both south and north, dominating the Caspian Sea even further. Neapolis took to the game of war like a fish to water, expelling the poorly organized Lokandu troops with relative ease. Livomo expanded in every direction, taking land in the north, south, and west. Scandinavia took the coveted prize of Trondheim for itself and executed the Livomo masters. Meanwhile, abroad, the Private Property Preservation Front was being armed by Washingtonian agents, leading to it redoubling its efforts and even managing to spill over into neighboring Burgosi territory. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Washington itself was cleaning up North America, focusing on taking out its parent country's holdings first before moving on to mop up their native allies. It felt as though it was only a matter of time before they came for Vannonian Mexico or Canada next. Interestingly, Vannonia performed rather poorly in the Continental War, failing most major offensives, especially those which attempted to regain the Aquitanian Corridor. All they managed to do was mop up some French exclaves in the north and prevent any more of their contiguous land from being taken. Vannonia really shined in its arms shipments and volunteer divisions to other countries, however, which helped to turn the tide in places like the Burgos Federation and Italy. Overall, all of these developments, mostly lightning-fast encounters and movements like those in Europe, were considered immense propaganda victories, and indeed many of them were simply immense victories outright. All of this would have been well and good were it not for the cost. The cost, which was paid over the course of a single year, perhaps the bloodiest single year in human history, was 20 million lives. An absolutely unimaginable conflagration of carnage had engulfed the continent, reshaping borders by swaths of thousands of miles, and they had run out of money for the war and nearly run out of people to continue fighting it. The Continental War might not have been the deadliest war in history, that title still remained with the Days of Blood, but it was certainly the most expensive. While manufacturing ramped up to an extreme and provided jobs for many, It still, even after all of this, failed to lift enough nations up out of the dearth to declare an end to it. As a result, trenches were dug, defensive lines were drawn, and the war would take on a distinctly different attitude from then on out. Gatling guns behind barbed wire and mass infantry movements were all supported by massive artillery pieces, and led to the conditions that would define the next 20 years. For some countries, war became their only industry, feeding their citizens into the maw of the meat grinder in exchange for what modicum of wealth they could extract from the circumstances. A few notable encounters were as follows. The Battle of Strasbourg Forest between 1880 and 1882 was an ambitious offensive by Poland-Lithuania, intending for Alençon forces to attack from behind while Poland-Lithuania kept the Italian forces occupied so they could encircle the Central European regions and weaken Italy. But this offensive did not go as planned. The forest itself was the grounds of the battle and resulted in brutal melee combat through the trees. The Alençon were unable to bring up the rear due to ironclad Italian gunner nests, leading to the main force being decimated in the field, to the tune of 150,000 men. The Battle of Barcelona was a Bergossi offensive against France that took place in 1885, where Bergossi ships blockaded the city and pounded at it from the bay with artillery for a whole week, softening it up for infantry movements into the city. However, when the Bergossi men arrived, they found urban combat to be one of the worst hells imaginable, and one they were not well suited for. Their major strength was in their wide maneuvering, which was not an option inside of a city. The losses were so uneven that it made history, with the French only losing 200 men against the Bergossi 15,000. Malian ships anchored in the Balearics came and relieved the city, leading to a naval battle where Bergossi ships had the day, but were still forced to turn back for resupply. The Battle of Trabzon was the bloodiest battle of the war, fought in 1890 between Lecandu and Neapolis. Lecandu set its sights upon that city because it was the only strip of territory which connected northern Neapolis to the rest of the country, and if they were cut off from that, the north would fall almost immediately, allowing Lecandu to attempt an invasion of puppeted Visegrad, hoping to regain them as an ally. However, Lecandu cavalry was met with miles of barbed wire, sea platform artillery, and sniper nests throughout the city. The Battle of Trabzon cost Lecandu 300,000 men, not including the second, third, and fourth battles of Trabzon, pursued from 1890 to 1894, costing a total of 1 million souls. Around 1895, things got desperate for all involved, and new horrific weapons of war were introduced into the conflict. Things like poison gas, flamethrowers, and even the use of diseased corpses. The trenches were filthy and nightmarish, filled with rats and crowded with the dead. Gains hadn't been made since the very first year of the war, and things at home in every country got worse and worse. Even as President Peter Quinney won re-election in 1883 on his victories achieved in the war's first year, his failure to deliver any more victories contrasted starkly with his tax hikes, food rationing, and worst of all, military draft. This was true of every country involved in the war, though it was worse in some than in others. Vannonia had a selective draft, while places like Poland-Lithuania had a universal male draft. Burdens were being placed upon the working class like never before. Unions were outlawed in most countries, and oftentimes people were worked to death to keep up with the demand of the military for weapons and ammunition. This was how the Continental War shaped the reality of a generation. That is, until something snapped. France had tolerated its tenuous alliance with the Francophone front for years now, though they were diametrically at odds. They shared common enemies, even if, in truth, they too were enemies. In January of 1896, the Crown attempted to enlist every man who called himself a communist for a special offensive against Tours, the most well-defended area in the entirety of the Vannonian front line. The brass of the Francophone front questioned this, as it felt like the Crown was simply trying to get rid of them. The truth was that the FF had been growing in strength as the war raged while the Crown was getting weaker. Men who managed to come home from the war, if they were still sane, were often vengeful that all they got was a medal when they got back. Nothing of any real value, nothing to help feed their starving families or house their homeless friends. It was often that these men joined the FF directly, or in some cases hung around bars and sang their praises, encouraging working men to go and join. This all came to a head when, in late November of that year, a protest was organized by the Francophone Front to be made a legal and participating party, permitted to seek remittances from the king. They marched through the streets of Cahors, though soon they were stopped by soldiers of the crown, who ordered them to cease their march. They refused. As they drew nearer, shots were fired, and the march turned into a riot, the police and local military detachment unable to contain it. The people, under the direction of the Francophone Front, took control of munitions factories and steel plants, as well as the fields which surrounded the city, declaring Cahors to be an independent entity known as the Cahors Commune, an axis upon which the global revolution would turn. The Battle of Cahors, however, would decide their fate. The French sent General Edouard Gabon, a cousin of the king himself, at the head of 30,000 men to stop the revolution in its tracks. Meanwhile, from among their ranks, the Cahors Commune chose Comrade Maxence Vachon to lead them, a former officer in the French army. These two had wildly different attitudes to war, and this showed in their battle, which began on the 21st of January 1897. General Edouard Gabon allowed them the opportunity of surrender, with the promise of prison and no threat of danger. They responded by burning his envoy alive. General Gabon, wishing to save the city itself, sent roughly 5,000 of his best men into the city to root out the communists. They were, however, outmatched, which became clear as their bodies began to appear hanging from the rooftop of the Cahors Cathedral, which was soon thereafter burned to ash. Mortar strikes then came from within the city itself against the crown forces, which led Gabon to authorize the use of artillery strikes against the city, declaring, "All that city and all its history have been lost. The rot is far too pervasive, and to cut it out will kill the city." However, all this did was reveal the true size of the communist forces as they emerged, which in truth dwarfed them. Soon enough, they entered combat. Comrade Vachon made use of his lightly armored infantry by scattering them into small 20-man units, which sprawled about the battlefield, some of them attempting to flank Gabon's men by disappearing into the forest which flanked that theater of battle. Gabon responded by rallying his mounted division to patrol the tree line, which managed to nullify the communists' flanking maneuver. Gabon then pressed forward down the middle with an infantry column, hoping to split the enemy in two and encircle each half. Comrade Vachon then utilized his secret weapon, which was poison gas. While in the city, they had access to all of its heaviest industrial solvents, allowing them to make chlorine gas from common mixtures, which they would then seal off in glass ampules about the size of a light bulb. Comrade Vachon ordered gas masks on, then commanded the gas bulbs thrown at the oncoming men. Gabon did not expect them to have this weapon, and his charging men were caught in the haze, drowning in their own blood and mucus. Gabon then ordered the enemy position decimated with artillery fire, but it was too late, as communist forces then charged through the cloud of gas and bayoneted the crown troops to death, including the general. With this, Comrade Maxence Vachon declared the dawn of the People's Republic of France, and the beginning of the revolution. Championing a banner of his own creation, it bore a tricolor gradient of white to red, representing the three main classes, and a circle with a quarter missing, representing majority rule. France, it was soon revealed, had been teetering on the edge for quite some while, as the crown had no men to spare from the front. France collapsed in short order, being reordered into a communist dictatorship under the leadership of Comrade Maxence Vachon. Vachon's vision of communism was one of global revolution, and he believed that the revolution could not survive without exporting it as widely as possible, so directed his new French Red Army, comprised mostly of Francophone Front troops, northeast toward Orléans, which was taken in short order, supplying a bridge to Poland-Lithuania. Vannin, Italy, and the Burgos Federation panicked immediately and attempted to partition France, which had fallen victim to a dangerous ideology. However, the communists had kept the trenches manned with their own men, and France was impenetrable, at least for the time being. In celebration, Maxence brought out the king from his house arrest and gave a short speech. "Comrades, you see here before you the dawn of the first French government. All other governments since the invention of money have been just that, governments of money, temples of finance. Our enemies lie at every corner, but our allies strain from beneath their boots, ready to join us. Let this tyrant be an example of how we intend to save the world." Comrade Vachon then brought a pistol to the head of King Germain Monoton the last French king, and fired. A domino effect washed over Europe with this gunshot, and in the next 2 months, successful revolutions had rocked Mali, Alençon, and Iskandaria, remade into the Mali Union, Alençon Socialist Republic, and the workers' state of Iskandaria. The veneer was pulled back, these states relied on entirely dissatisfied underclasses to function, and when they stopped working, the very states that depended upon and abused them crumbled. The civilized world was thrown into a state of panic, with Lakandu invading and annexing their former puppet Iskandaria. By late 1889, communist revolutions had broken out in every major European country, and while some were able to quell them, many others were not. Vannonia had to contend with a major revolution based out of Helby in the north, and was just able to win the fight and prevent an overthrow of the government by use of artillery strikes against several major industrial centers in the north. However, this allocation of resources also meant that Vannonia lost control of its South American colonies, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia finally managing to declare independence from Vannonia, remaining stalwart slave states. War between the three immediately broke out as the Private Property Preservation Front operated out of Brazil and wanted control over all former colonial territory. The Burgos Federation only suffered a minor revolt near Braganza, despite being the literal birthplace of communism, as the government had regained the confidence of the people since the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. Italy was rocked with a huge rebellion in their North African colonies, but they were well funded and organized enough to eventually push the revolutionaries out of Italian Africa and into neighboring Mali. Scandinavia suffered a revolution so severe that, while the government managed to remain intact, it lost control of Finland, which became an independent communist state called the Workers' Republic of Finland, made up solely of ethnic Scandinavians who were resentful of the Jews as a bourgeois group, adopting a brand of nationalist communism inspired by Francophonism. Things changed, however, when Poland-Lithuania suffered a successful revolution in 1900. Led by a certain General Dobrogost Brožek, he was actually on the verge of being sacked by the Imperial Defense Ministry on accusations of abusing his recruits, right when his men brought before him a nameless Frenchman, attempting to get them to defect and kill their general. Hearing the news in the world, he sensed an opportunity. He had the Frenchman sit with him and explain the tenets of Marxism, to which he took very well. Being himself a man born in the societal gutter, he made a name for himself in the Continental War, meaning he was able to appeal to the poor in his country. He brought the Frenchman back out with him and gave a small speech to his men. "Today is a fortuitous day, comrades. You did the right thing bringing him to me, but there is an opportunity here. You and I both hate the weak-willed elite, made so by money or by blood. They slouch weakly over their chaise lounges and bark orders at us, workers, soldiers, real men. By following the path of communism set out for us by our friends to the West, we can rebuild society in a new framework, where all are equal, where all men have their worth in the grand machine of the state, like soldiers in a grand battalion of labor and justice. Let us now begin to give our countrymen meaning." General Brožek was able to rally his men and topple the established order, marching on Warsaw and burning the city to the ground. During his campaign, he theorized a new branch of Marxism, called Brožekite Marxism. Brožekite Marxism proposed that instead of emerging from intelligentsia or industrial workers, the revolution is best served by sprouting from the military, and instead of achieving a stateless society, society should be reorganized into a grand militaristic model, where every man finds purpose in the state and is valued equal to his comrades, feasting at the same table, fighting the same fight. It wasn't long before the People's Liberation Commonwealth, or the PLC, pressed on and annexed their puppet, Visegrad. The Livomo monarchy tried to fight back, but was forced into submission, same as Wallachia and the Russian Empire, remade into the Livomo Workers' State, People's Republic of Wallachia, and Soviet Union respectively. Neapolis, upon witnessing these invasions, broke that alliance and invaded the exclaves their former ally had in Anatolia. It was at this point that the world was at a crossroads. Italy convened the Second Malta Accords, inviting delegates from Vannonia, Scandinavia, Neapolis, Lakandu, and even India and China. Here it was proposed that the Continental War was to be declared over, and a military alliance of the world's remaining anti-communist powers was to be established. Italy, Vannonia, Scandinavia, Neapolis, and shockingly China agreed to these terms, thus founding MADSO, short for the Malta Accords Defense and Security Organization. Meanwhile, Lakandu and India declined to join, not seeking to put them or their people in the middle of some power struggle which only portended infinite future wars. As such, they were the founding members of the non-aligned movement. Meanwhile, seeing this, General Dobrogost Brojek convened the communist nations of the world to the city of Cahors for the Cahors Conference, proposing the establishment of a grand military alliance led by the PLC, and an agreement to focus on collectively pooling resources in order to improve the communist states that already existed, before attempting to export the revolution as they had been. Such inward-focusing policy being a defining characteristic of General Brojek's theory. The People's Liberation Commonwealth ensured that those well within their sphere of influence joined without question, like the People's Republic of Wallachia, Livomo's Workers' State, and the Soviet Union, while the Workers' Republic of Finland and the Mali Union agreed of their own volition. Meanwhile, the People's Republic of France and the Alençon Socialist Republic rejected the terms of the Cahors Conference, with Comrade Maxence Vachon declaring that if the revolution does not continue, then the revolution is dead, and he would not have a military dog usurp his mission towards utopia. General Brojek then shot him 3 times in the chest, and a panic ensued, resulting in 300 of Vachon's closest supporters fleeing the continent and eventually arriving at Antamoro in Madagascar, establishing the Maxencist school of Marxist thought, defined by constant and unceasing revolutionary momentum. The conference itself, however, continued, and General Brojek added the stipulation that all signatories agreed to advance a Brojekite vision of communism, to which all present delegates agreed. And so, the Cahors Collective Comradeship Coalition, colloquially known abroad as the Quad C, was founded, and the Continental War was officially ended, as agreed upon by all involved parties, the total death toll reaching about 45 million dead. The world had passed through a crucible of unimaginable change. Threats which were manageable on their own, like the dearth, communist militias like the Francophone Front, or the Continental War itself, came together to present history with a dire turning point. Now the world found itself firmly divided between ideological camps, alliances so vast and imposing that they matched each other for strength, and all those caught between them were faced with certain doom. MADSO and Quad C thought not of honor or of glory, but simply of survival, of cold and utilitarian victory. This age would prove to be a dark one, defined by the anxiety of total war and the reality of proxy conflict. But, for now, in the year 1900, each shell-shocked alliance pursued their own path out of the dearth, and focused on preparation for what was bound to be, by all accounts, an exhausting century.